Fantastic. Well, we've got a nice crowd, nice virtual crowd there. Thanks ever so much for joining us. Welcome to Gazzelli Art House's Tuesday Talk. This is a sort of educational program that we have at the gallery that we've been running for the past 5 years or so. And Tuesday Talks are really an opportunity for us to kind of put together a sort of educational program. And we traditionally have done things like artist talks, panel discussions, and things like that. Tonight, we are delighted to present a panel discussion in conjunction with our current exhibition. We will be learning more about abstract expressionist painter Perle Fine and her practice, plus more specifically about a body of work from the early 1960s that she made called the Cool series, which is currently on display in our London gallery until the end of February. We are incredibly grateful to be joined by Maddy Berezov, who is the manager of Perle Fine's legacy, Kathleen Housley, who is the author of Tranquil Power, The Art and Life of Perle Fine, and independent curator Susan Knowles, who organized a big touring show of Perle Fine's work between 2009 and 2011. Just a little bit of quick housekeeping before we start. We ask that you remain muted, although we will have time for a Q&A at the end of the talk. You can submit your questions into the chat section of Zoom, and we will also be recording all of this as well, and making it public later, so you can watch this back as well. Just a very brief introduction to Perle Fine. She was a member of the abstract expressionist movement, and based very much in sort of New York, in sort of 30s, 40s, 50s period, which was obviously a very fertile period for the abstract expressionist movement. But we're going to go more in depth into Perle Fine's practice, and I think really the first question that I just want to ask the panelists is how you guys became aware of Perle Fine's work, and where that's your own personal sort of interest in her practice began. So Kathleen, I wonder if we could start with you. Kathleen Housley, author of Tranquil Power, a book all about Perle Fine's practice. I wonder if you could just give us a bit of background of how you personally got into Perle's work.
My first book on art history was on a collector of 20th century art, of absolutely powerhouse collector. And in the 1940s, this woman, Emily Hall Tremaine, thought so much of Perle Fine's art that she bought 4 of her paintings and hung them on the walls in her New York apartment next to her Picassos and her Mondrians. And Tremaine had a reputation of supporting young artists and really making their careers. She would make the career, for example, of Jasper Johns later on, and also Andy Warhol. So my question, as I came off my first book, is, she thought so highly of Perle Fine's work at that point in time. She worked so hard to get her name in the world. How come Perle Fine is not far more well-known than she is? What was it? And I've always begun books with a big question. It's a question to me. And the question was, Perle Fine was of stellar quality in terms of her art. How come her career did not take off? And to put it in a nutshell, she ran into rampant sexism very early on. But it launched me on about a 3-year research project to really get to know this remarkable woman. And that's how I came about loving her art and really appreciating her.
Fantastic. And Susan, so Susan Knowles, you were an independent curator. You put together this big touring show of Perle's work roughly about 10 years ago. Was Perle Fine an artist you were familiar with before, and how did you come about learning about her practice in general?
She was not, and a friend put me in touch with Maddy and Dave Berezov, a fellow art historian, because they had brought the studio contents to Nashville and archived them and stored them and cared for them over this period of time. And Maddy said, you know, I'm determined to do this. And so as I learned about Perle, I saw, you know, here was this model, strong, independent woman whose art was the most important thing in her life, was determined in every way. And that kind of single-mindedness, and then her husband wanting to continue her legacy, he then passes on to his favorite nephew, and Maddy, his wife and strong woman herself, is determined to follow this through. And so then here's Kathleen Housley, who's another independent, strong, you know, she's a feminist art historian, scholar. And I already knew of Cynthia Navarrete and Mid-March Arts Press in New York because she had undertaken other publications to publish the words of artists, the things about artists' community and artists' lives, and in many cases, artists who are not famous, but they were right in the middle of the scene, like Milton Resnick. I already had his book. So, and I'm an art historian married to an artist, so I know how quickly, you know, an artistic reputation can fade with time. And when I looked at Perle's resume, I saw the path. I saw, you know, she's collected in all these museums. That's the proof. She was there. Her work is in these major collections. So that was.
Yeah. I mean, just a very brief sort of like précis of her career more generally. I mean, she was like taught under Hans Hofmann, like a lot of the other major ABEX artists. She was in the at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of This Century gallery. I think she had her first show there, if I'm right, in the mid-40s. And then in 1950, I believe she was sponsored by Willem de Kooning and included in as the first female member of the 8th Street Artists Club. Is that right? So that's, and of course, part of the 9th Street show, which was this major exhibition in 1951, which included people like Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, and, you know, all the major sort of big hitters of that ABEX movement. So yeah, Maddy Berezov, you're obviously the manager of Pearl Fine's legacy, but you're also the niece, of course, of Pearl Fine. Yeah, just was sort of curious to know what piqued your interest in Pearl Fine's work when you first came across this archive.
Well, I have a story to tell you that is absolutely true. My husband and I and my newborn son traveled to East Hampton from Nashville to meet with Maurice. Perle had already passed, and he knew that he had to do something to pass on the legacy. So we visited him, took him to dinner, and he looks at my husband and says, "David, you need to promote Aunt Pearl's work. She was the artist. Don't care about my work. I'm not a good artist, but she was special." And my husband says, "Yes, Uncle Maurice, I promise I will take care of her legacy and promote it and get her name out there." And then my husband turns around and says, "You know, you will be doing this work, don't you?" With a brand new house and a brand new baby. But yes, I undertook the collection and have managed it for the past 30 years. To the best of my ability.
We've obviously done a great job because, you know, Pearl has, we're going to talk a bit more about how she was sort of overlooked over the past several decades, but more recently has had this big resurgence and interest in her career. So obviously your management of her legacy is going well, you know, which is good. So Kathleen, you mentioned a bit about one of the things we do want to sort of talk about is how come Pearl has been sort of slightly overlooked, given the sort of CV of where she was making work, and also you know, the kind of shows she was doing and the artists she was hanging out with and all the rest of it. You mentioned a sort of rampant sexism in the art world at that time. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that. So what was preventing women particularly from reaching that sort of exposure that men were getting?
I'll give you a very precise example. During the 1940s, she does have shows. She has shows at Nierendorf Gallery. But in the very early 1950s, she is represented by Betty Parsons, big New York gallery. Betty Parsons has a very good lineup of artists. Well, in about 1950-51, I'm not exactly sure what the date, 4 of those artists who call themselves the Giants, which was Rothko, Newman, Still, and I think Pollock was the 4th, approached Betty Parsons and said, we want you to throw out all the other artists in your gallery and represent only these 4 males.
Oh, wow. Betty
Parsons was dismayed, and so was Pearl Fine, because Pearl Fine's big exhibition was right after Rothko's. And Parsons said no, and all 4 of them left the gallery.
Oh, wow.
It was a huge hit, not just to Parsons, but also to Pearl. Pearl's work did not sell after that at Betty Parsons' gallery, and they finally split ways amicably. But it's a case in point of that there was both huge gatekeeping by gallery owners, not by Parsons, but by many gallery owners, keeping women out. But then there was also very strong sexism among other artists and among collectors. And the point with collectors, and it still holds true today, is that even though they may have loved the painting and bought it for pure aesthetic reasons, in another part of the collector's brain was, is it going to appreciate over time, financial value? And it was absolutely a law of the market at that time that men's paintings appreciated in value, whereas women's did not. So it was a sexism that was both built into the system culturally, it was also built into the system financially. And that's what she was pushing against.
What was her, I wonder if, Susan, you could tell us a bit more about her connection, just talking about sort of sexism and the art scene at that time. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about her relationship with Peggy Guggenheim, because there were a couple of sort of female gallerists in that New York scene, weren't there? And Betty Parsons, of course, being one of the major ones. But didn't she do some stuff with Peggy Guggenheim as well at that time?
Well, I don't know that I can really, and I'll let Kathleen talk about Peggy Guggenheim, but I wanted to mention the stamp of approval really from Karl Nierendorf. I mean, that early on, a Berlin dealer who came to the US, and also Marion Willard, another female gallerist in New York who showed Pearl's work before Betty Parsons. And so, you know, there were others who recognized her early on, and Nierendorf sort of provided her a stipend, and Louise Nevelson he did the same for. So it's a huge deal. I mean, she was recognized early on. And the funny story about the Art of the Century gallery show was that's where she changed her birth date so she could be in an exhibition that was it Artists Under 35, Kathleen?
Yeah.
And so at that point, and so this is 1943, so she changed her birth date from 1905, which was actual, to 1908. So she could be among the young artists. I'm sure she was young in spirit, and nobody could have, you know, when you're that age, you can't tell. But the other thing I was going to mention about the Guggenheim, not Peggy, but the Guggenheim money, was the Hilary Bay, who was overseeing the doling out these bits of money to artists for her non-objective ends, you know. And so Pearl had to write her and claim that her work was completely non-objective in order to argue for some support. And so that's very painful. I mean, in that way, that was a woman who wasn't helping. She had her own agenda and she was trying to accomplish something. And if you could fit into it, she would reward you with a small support.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's nothing like a Guggenheim Foundation fellowship or anything like that. It was just, you know, she was the dragon guarding the lair at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Look, may I say something?
Please, Maddy.
To follow along with Susan, while Hilla was a very strong-minded woman, and so was Perle, Hilla did purchase some paintings personally so that Perle would not lose her studio. She was on the verge of being evicted from her studio. Money was so tight. And Hilla stepped up to the plate. And there are several paintings of Perle that are at the Guggenheim through the Hilla Rebay estate.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
And
The same with
also-
Carl Nierendorf, Susan.
Yeah.
He did give her a stipend. And she, I think, thrived with Carl because I have the notebooks of all the paintings that she sold to him or consigned to him. And he was instrumental in launching her career and her state of mind as an artist.
Yeah.
I think Carl Nierendorf, more than anyone,
Absolutely.
set her on the trajectory of being an artist.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's a really important point. The works that are in the Guggenheim collection, both Hilary Bay, but there's some really fine works that are from Nierendorf's collection there. And so we found that core, you know, when we went looking, and Maddy had already pursued that and knew of it. So
Yeah.
May I add just a comment for all the people who are listening, that the thing about Nierendorf, which was so critically important, was that he had come from Germany and he was absolutely up to date on what was happening in Germany. And he was very international in his perspective. So when he comes to the United States, because of the war, he's bringing a sensibility which Americans don't have. And he's open to works that other gallerists are not. And that makes him extremely important. Unfortunately, he dies of a heart attack quite suddenly. So his influence ends, but it is very important to see that with Perle Fine.
There was a sort of, a well-known kind of trope around the abstract expressionist sort of movement where there's a lot of sort of European influence, isn't there? I mean, I'm thinking also with Hans Hofmann and his,
Right.
his sort of tutorage. I want to go back a little bit into and talk, before we go on to talk more specifically about the Cool series, which is a hugely interesting body of work. I just want to dwell a little bit more on the kind of atmosphere around Perle's sort of early career. And there was an artists club on 8th Street in New York, which was a very kind of like, it's seemingly a very influential place. Is it right that Perle Fine was the first sort of woman who was kind of granted access to this club? Is that a fair statement to make about what was happening there?
If not the first, one of the earliest, yes. And the club was very important for a place to exchange ideas and to open up artists to each other's work. So yeah, it was an important place to be and really a place to grow and share.
Because as we talked a bit about how the market, one of the sort of forces really that kind of we're discussing about Perle Fine being sort of slightly overlooked is the market. And as we know, the sort of abstract expressionist movement became a huge financial behemoth, if you like, and a huge sort of market. But the early days of the 8th Street Club, what it sounds to me like was back in those early days, it was a kind of a free exchange of ideas and artists wanting to kind of create their own scene, which leads us on a little bit to the 9th Street show, which seemed to me like kind of contemporaries wanting to, you know, put into a physical space the kind of things they were talking about at the club. So it seems like there's sort of the origins of this scene were very much about a kind of community of artists. Do you think that's sort of fair, or is that me looking back with sort of rose-tinted spectacles a bit?
I think that's fair. I think most of the artists at that time were living in Greenwich Village. So they lived next door to each other. They lived on top of each other on these apartment buildings. And they did have a camaraderie, and it fed each artist's excitement and energy to be in that close knit, geographically and psychologically, I should say. So,
And
but
it was
I
very
did
much.
want to mention one thing, if I may. The club was basically a bunch of men artists, and de Kooning had sponsored Perle, and there was one artist that said, no, I don't want her involved. And she comes to the meeting, and it was Lewiton, and he says, well, I voted against you, but he relented, and so she was able to join the club. So that brings in that sexism. We don't want a woman in here.
Mm-hmm.
It was, and you have to remember, it was right around the end of World War II. Women were working, men come home from overseas, and the women go home, get married, and have families. And the men take over the jobs. It was very different in the US right after the war.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that just perpetuated throughout, I think, her career.
Yeah. I wonder if we can move on to talk more specifically about the Cool series, because maybe that will feed into kind of the context of the sort of work Perle was making kind of before and after that specific body of work.
And I guess one thing, George, I wanted to say about the club was, I mean, it was really a forum for ideas. I think they made presentations and had discussions. And Maddy, I believe you've got some of Perle's notes about some of the ideas she was going to bring forward at certain meetings. And so I think her temperament, and you see in the quotes you have here in this presentation, where she really was, you know, very philosophical about what she was trying to do, and could not only state it clearly in words, and she did write about her work, as you can see, but then endeavored to do it. So I think it was really formative and important for her to hold her own in that group of men.
Yeah.
With, you know, maybe only one other woman or two other women present at a time.
One of the things that I responded to with Perle early on is that when you look at abstract expressionist painters, there's this tendency to over-focus on those who led the large, dramatic, rather out of control life. You know, the Pollock getting in bar fights and multiple mistresses and all this kind of stuff. And the fault is partially our own, in that we are all attracted to that kind of dramatic persona. Perle was very quiet, but she was very strong in what she believed. Very strong in what she believed. But she wouldn't get into barstool throwing fights over it. And even by the time of the club, she was seen, like de Kooning was, as the painter's painter. In other words, she knew what she was doing. She was classical in a way, in terms of her knowledge, and that comes out of both her training with Nierendorf at the Art Students League and also with Hans Hofmann. So the club gives her a chance to speak out, and in a way that isn't like over at the Cedar Bar, where they're all getting in fights. You can see her own personality coming through.
Are we all happy to talk a bit about the Cool series?
Yeah.
Cool. So what sort of struck me as interesting about the Cool series is, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like what is kind of interesting about this body of work is that it seems to be almost like a kind of island or a sort of separate entity in the sort of lineage of her career. And this kind of moving away from one body of work and transitioning into a different sort of set of works as well. The Cool series kind of sitting in between these two different like periods somehow. It seems like the whole series was made only really between sort of 61 and 63, I think is that right? And so sort of like very short period of time that she was making this work. I was wondering if you guys could educate me a bit more about what she was doing before the Cool series and how it came about as this kind of separate body of work. Because for me, I find that story very, very exciting. I wonder if Kathleen, maybe you could kick us off talking about that.
I'd be happy to. We're coming off the high period of abstract expressionism in New York City, and Perle is a little dissatisfied at this point, and she's trying to find a way forward. She doesn't have a gallery. She moves out to the Springs in the end of Long Island, which is a very beautiful place, and it gives her solitude. It gives her the time to paint without the pressure of being down in Greenwich Village. And it's at this point that she starts to prepare an exhibition for the Graham Gallery, and she is not happy with it. And she destroys the entire exhibition. And she says that as strong as it was too pleasant. And she wants to see how far she can go with simplification, but not becoming simple. If you know, there's a difference here. And I'm just going to read one thing that she wrote on this. She said, I had a whole exhibition ready to go out, and I decided it was not going to go. I destroyed every painting there. I said, well, it's good, but it's not good enough. I learned more from that experience with no one there to say, save this one, don't do this. I just had the feeling, and it was a very important feeling, that nobody really cared. Only I had to care enough to do this and to know that I could do better. And I had to destroy it in order for it not to exist. But I learned more from that experience than from anything that ever happened in my life.
Oh, wow.
That feeling was the basis of everything that I had to do. If a painting didn't have that depth of feeling, that intense degree of depth of feeling, it would have had absolutely nothing. And that's the precursor to the Cool series.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's an incredible sort of freshness about the body of work.
Mm-hmm.
You get a sense, great sense of energy being in the space and being surrounded by that series of paintings. I wonder if so Susan, maybe you could talk a bit more about the Cool series and your understanding of what she was getting at with the works and how that where she was coming from before that and where she went into after the Cool series as well. Perhaps teach us a bit about what that was about.
Well, the way I see the through line in her career is the influences and the people she sought out to study with. Hoffman in particular, but he then brought synthetic cubism with Braque and the Surrealists and the other latest modern works that from Europe with him in his teaching. But he was a master of the brush, and I wanted to talk about, and I think we talked about this a little bit, the also influence on her work from Mondrian.
Yeah,
she was involved with the American Abstract Artists Association, or American Association of Abstract Artists, and so when he came to New York, when these ex-Europeans came to New York in this period, he was another who had a profound influence on her. So if you think about the palette and the brushwork and the techniques that she learned from Hoffman, and planes in space from him too, as well as Mondrian's grid, and then you start to see where she's honing in to find her way of expressing. And what I see in this Cool series is this kind of purity that she's living out in nature now, and she's listening. She's in the very rural part. She's aware of all the sensual things about being that isolated and away from the city. And so I think that the workings of her mind are really, really important as well. And I think we see that combination in this work. And also, I think she was listening to music, and she was aware of the avant-garde trends where there was a real intellectual side to the music that was being composed and played by her peers at the time.
Mm.
And then there's also popular, swing and jazz that's really alive and happening in the clubs and in the atmosphere. And I feel that this work kind of represents that peak of all these things kind of cresting together.
It's a sort of funny combination, because obviously the Cool series is a very hip, it's a very hip title. And like you say, a lot of the titles of the paintings themselves sort of somehow seem to reference contemporary musical culture. I wonder, Maddy, whether you could shed a bit more light on how the Cool series was received, and what, if you've noticed anything from Pearl Fine's archive about, did she talk about that, how people responded to the Cool series and how that went down?
Not specifically, but I do have a quote from her.
Excellent.
regarding the Cool series. She said, "To put it more clearly, I think it's the constants of the horizontal and the verticals, which when put together, of course, form a square or rectangle, compressed or extended, or whatever you will. But since it relates most closely to the first plane of the picture, which is the horizontal and vertical, I felt, and very strongly felt, that was the form for me." And then she continues with, she's paying homage to Mondrian, because he really did influence her way. "I think it's what Mondrian called first the static balance, and the second the dynamic equilibrium. They are both achieved in this one form." And then she says, "The expression through color and through an emotion about the color has become so necessary to express that it simply wasn't enough to do the painting in an absolute vertical, horizontal, black, white, and red thing." So she was very strongly influenced by Mondrian, the horizontal and the vertical planes, and color. Color always played an important part in all of her paintings.
So if I could jump in here with something, when we were organizing the exhibition for travel, of course, these are older works. And so we had a conservator who's an expert in modern painting come to Nashville. Maddy and Dave brought her Ingelisa Ekman Lane, who she's a well-known conservator, and she worked at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art for a long while. And we had her write the essay in the book, because I thought it would be very interesting to have someone who is looking at painting all the time comment that way. And I wanted you're showing details of these works, and I think this is very evident in this work, that what Ingelisa noted was that the brush technique of Hoffman, Pearl really made her own way with it. She created textural interest on her canvases by painting different areas differently. So the different color areas are actually painted with different strokes. And it creates then a sensual surface interest for these that really, they bear close-up study. I wish we could all walk around the gallery, and you all are so fortunate to be in London and you can do that. But so this is just quoting Ingelisa. Hoffman's signature was his expressive touch, the vigorous, he pushed, stroked, and splashed paint. The facility of the paint handling influenced her, but her own was very distinctive, contrasting daubs and playful strokes with smooth passages to create variety and an energetic rhythm. So, and I think you see it here. And then she, as Maddy said, she went with her own color palette. Yeah. Unusual, really deeply beautiful. Look at what we're looking at.
Yeah. I mean, I do see it as a very sort of radical body of paintings. And I wonder, Kathleen, whether you could tell us a little bit more about what sort of happened after this period as well, because it wasn't a sort of, it didn't seem to me like a kind of a body of work that she continued to make for years and years and years. Again, maybe typical of Perle Fine's sort of restless, like creative energy, that she doesn't want to just do the same thing over and over and over again. She wants to kind of challenge herself, move on into different areas of painting and things like that. I'm not sure if that's a fair thing to say, but what was happening after this, Kathleen, and what was the sort of result of this cool series body of work that she made? What do you think she sort of learned from it or got from it, or how did it move on?
She never liked to be put in a category. Well, no artist does. And she wrote once that, you know, it's easy well after 40, 50, 60 years after a painter's death to start slotting them in. But what the need was always in the painting itself. It was always an aesthetic question for her that she was addressing. And what I have found rather remarkable about Perle Fine's work is, irregardless which period you're looking at, I can tell it's her work even if I don't know the work. There is about it an expressiveness which is hers. So that, to me, for example, her abstract expressionist work and her later what she called the accordment series, there is, I can see her ideas about color. I can see her ideas about the surface, as Susan was talking about, are still there. And what she moves to is a kind of minimalism, but I use that word kind of guardedly, because it's, again, a very profound and deep type of minimalism. You know, someone has said, well, is her work color filled? And I would say, no, I would say her work is force field. Now, I'm using a term from physics here, but think about a force field with two magnets and you have iron filings in the middle, and there is a force there that's pulling at the painting. That is in Perle Fine's paintings, and it's from the first to the last. And Maddy talked about Mondrian's idea of equilibrium and equivalences. Well, that kind of power, you know, some people have said, oh, it's static. No, a Mondrian such as the 50 Boogie Woogie, which was so important to Perle, is not static at all. And neither are any of Perle's. The idea of a force field speaks to me more strongly and pointedly as to what she was achieving than any of the categories that you could stick her in.
We touched a little bit on the sort of references to music and pop culture in this cool series in particular. I wonder if, Maddy, you could shed a bit of light on what you know about Perle Fine's relationship to music. I know we touched on it a little bit before from Susan, of course. And I thought it was a really interesting point, because also, of course, what was happening in the early 60s, the next sort of the next big art movement was pop art, of course, wasn't it? So this sort of, the interesting thing about this cool series is, you know, in that period of the early 60s, the next big wave of contemporary art was all about referencing popular culture. Maddy, do you know if Perle was kind of tuned into, you know, sort of popular culture and music? Was that an influence for her, or not so much? I'm just sort of interested in that.
Well, I do know that her sister was a pianist, and Perle did take some piano lessons, but she begged off to do other things because she did not have the talent that her sister did. I do know that very early on she had a radio, and she would always listen to classical music, from my understanding. Now, living in the village, obviously she was going to be listening and hearing music from the 50s, from the 40s and the 50s. But did they have a record player? Did they listen to records? No, I don't think they spent money on that type of thing. She had a large radio, and it was tuned into the classical stations.
Yeah. It's just a question for all of you, really. Do you think that she saw the Cool series as a successful body of work? Do you think that was a body of work that she was you know, that she was ultimately happy with, and that and thought that it was a success. Because for me, looking at it, it's such a vibrant, energetic body of work, and to get the stuff in a physical space, it's absolutely fantastic. And I just wonder what you guys know about how she felt about the entire sort of Cool series. Yeah, from a sort of personal perspective.
Well, George, let me just remember, I read that quote from her before about how important it was to her. I'm just going to read the last line of the quote because it does speak to what you're asking. Once she had done that exhibition, she said, "And I went out with such confidence because I knew what I was talking about. And I have that feeling today that I can face anything because I know what it's based on." That makes the Cool series extremely important to the rest of her work.
So a sort of departure from this kind of like doubt about what she was doing before. This was a real cementing her self-confidence as a painter, you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it took a lot of courage to leave what she was doing, which was the abstract expressionist and the collages. She was very comfortable with them. This took courage. This was totally different.
Yeah, I mean, you really get that sense from you know, being familiar with her sort of work before that, that this is a hugely sort of confident move by her. You do get a sense from that in the paintings themselves. I wonder whether we should open up. We're just getting to 6:45 now. I wonder whether, to keep things sort of moving, we should open up to find out if anyone watching has any questions for us. You can type your questions into the chat box here. Yeah, so if you have any questions that you want to ask the panelists about Pearl Fine's work, please do jump in. Otherwise, I can ask a few more, so don't feel shy.
Well, one thing I would like to say about the critical reception, I think, of the exhibition was positive. I mean, I think she did also get some, you know, good feedback there. Soon after this, though, she went to teach at Hofstra University. I mean, she needed to stay out on Long Island and make a living. And I think maybe she kind of invented the next thing to do. And that was a series where she took the geometry, but she made it three-dimensional. And so there are these built panels with geometry that are sort of a combination of what she was doing before, but with the still geometric forms, but busier than these pieces. And then she goes on to do the quieter accordment pieces. So I do see, you know, that this led to a further exploration of how you could work with geometry in physical space. Because she had always done, like we talked about, she'd always done collage. She'd always put things from the real world, little bits of things, onto her canvases and worked with the surfaces to build them up like Hoffman would, you know, in some areas, to really make a lot of interest in three-dimensionality. So.
There was sorry, go on.
Before you close, could I read you a quote?
Yeah.
That I think sums up her life as an artist. She said this in July of 1976. So she would have been in her early 70s, had a full career as an artist. She says, "I never thought of myself as a student or a teacher, but as a painter. I have a strong feeling that almost anything I do is pretty good. I don't paint to sell. I don't paint not to sell. When I paint something, I am very much aware of the future. If I feel that something will not stand up 40 years from now, I'm not interested in doing that kind of thing."
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly achieved. She certainly achieved that with this body of work. I mean, it just looks so fresh still. You know.
Yes, it does. It's still current.
Yeah.
60 years later, it's still current and exciting.
Yeah. Well, it looks like everyone's a little bit nervous about asking a question, which is fine. I just wonder whether, just before we close, again, this is sort of working a little bit back to front, actually, but it's something that I just thought about while you were talking, is what Perle's actual kind of motivations were to be an artist in the first place. Was there some sort of kind of, is there something you can point to that was a huge influence on her beginning to become a painter in the first place?
Absolutely.
Maybe we should have asked that at the start, but I just just thought that while you were talking.
I have some information about that. She said that let me try to rephrase this. At one point she says nothing really had a bearing on her becoming an artist except her sister. Her sister, I believe the pianist, I'm not quite sure, Kathleen, which sister this was, but her older sister encouraged her to draw just as soon as Perle could hold a pencil. And I understand there were drawings on walls and over the bed and all over the house. But when she went to grammar school, she received a lot of encouragement, and she would win little awards for posters, because this was during World War I, and there were lots of poster competitions. And she won quite a few throughout grammar school. And then she says by the time she got to high school, she knew that's what she wanted to do. So she started just as soon as she could.
Yeah, I have only one line to add to that, George, and that is that her sister-in-law told me it was art from the day she was born. That's what she said.
Wow, that's a great quote, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've got a question here from Paul. Thanks for joining us, Paul. Nice to hear from you. So the question is, could the collage title of A Persuasive Stillness be applied to describe the Cool series? So could the collage title of A Persuasive Stillness be applied to describe the Cool series? So is there a sort of stillness, a persuasive stillness? That's a great question, actually. What do you guys think?
Well, I think it refers to a painting that is not a Cool series.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, that's the collage title. Okay,
Yeah,
but could it be?
Title, but I know she called them the Cool series for a reason. I don't remember what persuasive stillness looks like. A date would help.
This is a work from 1963.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so she was 1963. Yeah. Gee, I can't say that. I can't tell. I don't remember. I'm sorry.
But I think it's a great title. I mean, I think there is a vibrating stillness in this work. And I think there's also a comfort. I mean, that's why, physically standing in front of the scale of these paintings and giving you some place to experience them could be consoling and persuasive. I think the combination, she wrote beautiful titles.
Yeah.
I think, and often the combination of two words that mean something when you put them together and sort of start you in is when an artist does it, I find it a great gift.
Well,
there's a real.
May I ask, when I named the book Tranquil Power, it's hard to name books. And when I hit that phrase, Tranquil Power, to me, it was the right one. And part of it is that, if I may borrow a theological idea, but make it simple, there's the idea of divinity being both transcendent and or immanent. And immanence draws one in. Immanence is an inner power that's quieter. It's not thunderstorms, it's not drama. If I were to apply a word to Perle Fine's work, and this is to the question that was asked, I would say her work is immanent, that it does not force itself on the viewer. it asks something of the viewer to come in and seek and find within that. And that again is in all her works. It's in the collages, it's in the Acquirement series, and it's in the Cool series.
Yeah. It's a sort of, I like the word drama, because that's a very good word to describe a kind of like abstract expressionist scene, really, isn't it? This idea of kind of romantic, dramatic people with expressive paintings. Like we've talked a bit more about the myth of sort of Pollock and people like that, really cementing their place as these sort of poetic, alcoholic sort of, crazy artists, which is, you know, a sort of trope of artists that's gone out throughout history, really. I mean, going back to going back hundreds of years, really. I've got another question here. Just wanted to discuss a bit more about the music and the jazz, etc., that link the paintings. I don't know, I feel like we have sort of discussed that a bit, but certainly when you look at the Cool series, you understand that it's from the early 60s, and then you read some of the titles like Deceptive Beat, for example, of this one. If she wasn't really listening to jazz, was she still kind of conscious of that popular culture and bringing that into this series? It's almost like blowing away the fustiness of sort of expressive painting and bringing in a new era. That's how it sort of appears to me. Do you think that's an accurate way of reading what was happening with this body of work?
Well, like I said, she was living in the village, and the music would have been coming out of the cafes and the restaurants, and I'm sure she was influenced by, just the title, Swinging Fool.
Yeah.
And I mean, in artist parties, which they had, I mean, Maurice's photographs and others show you, artist gathering, and they would have been listening to the latest. They would have been listening to, this amazing jazz coming out of, in proto-civil rights, really, a lot of political content in that music as well. Yeah. And so I think, like Maddy's saying, I mean, downtown New York was, that's where it was happening. So.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Well, I think we might draw it to a close. I think unless anyone's got any last minute questions, I'll give you a couple of minutes to write something down. Or I think maybe we're done with the questions. I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I mean, thank you so much to Maddy, Susan, and Kathleen. We will be publicising the short. We've just got a quick question, just as I was about to wrap things up. So after she went east and left the influences of the group, did she maintain close friendships with any of the New York artists? That's a great question. Not a question, thoughtful discussion. Thank all of you for your time and sharing. I'm definitely hungry for more of her writings and interviews. Fantastic. So yeah, the question is, after she sort of left the madness of New York, did she maintain friendships with those guys?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes, because the artists followed. A lot of the artists went out to the Springs section of East Hampton. And so they had huge artist parties. And so they were still very friendly. In fact, when Perle passed, de Kooning signed her register. And so many of the artists that were still living had gone to her funeral. They were a close-knit group. Maybe they differed and had lively discussions about art at the Cedar Gallery and at the artist parties. But yeah, she did. They were very much involved in the group.
Yeah.
And we haven't mentioned, I don't think we've mentioned Lee Krasner, who was a fellow student of hers with Hoffman. And so Krasner and Pollock had already moved out there. So the Pollock-Krasner house is very near where Perle and Maurice bought property. And so then, like Maddy said, there were many other artists who came out and established themselves out there. And if you look at a book like Hampton's Bohemia, you look at the photographs of who was there, and you look at Maurice Berezov's photographs of so many of these artists in their studios throughout this time. I mean, that's a real treasure trove of, and a part of this legacy is his his amazing photographs, because he had quite a compositional eye and a warmth
Yeah.
to
And again, sort of Perle being central to the sort of New York scene, then becoming central to the Hampton scene. You know, kind of, you know, moving those around. Right, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. It's very kind of you to give us your time and have a listen to our discussion. And obviously, we're hugely grateful to Maddy, Susan, and Kathleen for leading this conversation. It's been really educational for me, and I hope that those watching it's been worthwhile for you guys as well. We will be publicizing this talk online, and we'll obviously maintain our relationships with you guys, of course, yeah, so keep an eye out for further readings and the talks about Perle Fine's Cool series. It's on display in London. Obviously, we're locked down at the moment. We're not open to the public, but you can view the work via our website and online. And if you want to contact us for a 3D mapping of the show, please just email us and we'll send you a link to that, and you can get a sense of the works in the space. But yeah, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next one.